Randy asked me to be here tonight, and I'm glad to do it. This is based on a class we did in conjunction with the Wyandotte County Races Group and Saturn back in February, I think it was, and we finally ended up doing it. And I've kind of cut it down because you guys don't have near as much time as they did. But we want to talk a little bit about, it is basically kind of why do we do emergency communications as ham radio? Why is that an important part, or why is that a big part of ham radio? So give you a little background on me. I'm NZ0F. I was originally minted as KD0JMD. And the reason that I became a ham was to get involved in emergency communications. I was a volunteer firefighter for 20 years, retired from that as a captain. And I really loved that, and it was a great, it was a big part of what I am and what I do, giving back to the community. And I thought, well, how am I going to do that going forward? Too old to be a firefighter. That is definitely a young man's sport. But what do I do to keep giving back to the community and stay involved in the emergency services kind of realm? So that's why I became a ham. But I remember the frustration that I felt in trying to figure out what all these various acronyms and Aries and Races and Saturn and all this kind of stuff, what it all meant, how they all went together, how to get involved with that. There's a lot of stuff on the web. There's a lot of data on the web. There's not much information on the web when it comes to these. We're better now than we used to be. So that's kind of what caused this this presentation to come to light, or to come to being. So we're going to talk about, why do we do emergency communications, if you don't already know that. We'll talk a little bit about the various emergency communications organizations that exist out there in the ham radio world, how you get started, and then what do you do once you get joined and hooked up with one of these folks. So the emergency communications is part of the ham DNA. You guys have probably heard me say this in a lot of ways, but right there in Part 97 at the very beginning of the definition of ham radio in FCC Rules and Regs Part 97, if you look at the bottom of that second paragraph there, we exist particularly with respect to providing emergency communications. So if there's any doubt in your mind that whether or not we belong in this business or not, right there will answer your question. A couple of quotes here. Chris Fugit is the past FEMA administrator. He has been replaced. But there's his quote about the importance of communications in general, but also the importance of amateur radio in support of emergency communications in times of disaster. So that's FEMA's perspective on it. The next perspective here is right out of the New Madrid Seismic Zone Earthquake Joint State of Missouri and Region 7 Response Operations Plan. Everybody say that together now. But that's right out of the Missouri State Emergency Management Agency plan for the New Madrid Seismic Zone. They recognize that amateur radio resources form part of their critical communications infrastructure.
That's the Boot Hill Jello plan.
That is the New Madrid Seismic Zone is the Boot Hill Jello Bowl down there, and the reason that is important to us is because all those people that get displaced in eastern and southeastern Missouri end up coming here. And so that becomes important to us for one reason or another. I'm from Johnson County, so I wanted to know what Johnson County thought about this, as if I didn't already know. But they say, again, they're looking at amateur radio as a vital resource in times of emergency. So that should give you an idea that it's kind of universally accepted that amateur radio is part of the emergency communications infrastructure that all the various emergency management and emergency response agencies rely on. I think we knew that. So the bottom line is that we bring unique equipment to the party. We bring unique skills, and that equals unique capabilities. It goes back to that logo that was on one of those first slides. When all else fails, everybody's seen that. When all else fails, amateur radio, and that's what we can do. So this is the part that confuses a lot of people, because you've got all these various emergency communications organizations, and how do they all fit together? Now, I will tell you that this changes from region to region. In fact, it's a little different on the Missouri side in the Kansas City area than it is on the Kansas side, but I'll try to explain the differences. So if you look, this is going to build up into a really pretty picture here in a minute. But if you start out, you've got everybody, to be an amateur radio operator, you got to have what? A license. So you got to have one of three licenses, technician, general, or extra. So once you get into that, then if I keep clicking here, there we go. Then there are some, or a large number, I think, of ham radio operators that want to get involved in one way or another in emergency communications. So there's this whole emergency communications discipline within amateur radio that forms a very significant part of that community. Within that, there is then this basic knowledge, if you will, of emergency communications, kind of a body of knowledge, if you will. That, in most cases, comes through ARES, Amateur Radio Emergency Services. Now, ARES is an ARRL construct, and so therefore it tends to be very regional in terms of the ARRL sections, and it tends to be by county. So there is a Johnson County, Kansas ARES, there is a Northland ARES group that covers Platte and Clay County, there's a Jackson County ARES group, there's a Wyandotte County, I think there's a Wyandotte County ARES group. But anyway, so there is, county by county, there are ARES groups associated with those. And they are, by and large, where amateur radio operators are intended to get their basic training in and their proficiency in emergency communications as a discipline. So that's the role of ARES. Now, it may grow into other things beyond that, depending on what locality you're in. If you get out into western Kansas, a lot of the ARES groups out there also do storm spotting. The Northland ARES group does storm spotting. I think the Jackson County ARES group, anybody here from Jackson County ARES? Yeah, I think you guys also do some storm spotting and work with emergency management. So on the Missouri side, a lot of the ARES groups also do what the RACES groups do in Kansas. So that's part of the confusion. Beyond that, we get into this whole resource typing and credentialing issue. That is primarily why we need to do the FEMA classes. There are some basic FEMA classes that help us understand how the emergency response coordination is done in an emergency. The incident command system, communications, the various emergency service functions, things like that. That is where those FEMA certifications come in. So, and then above that, you've got all these other organizations. So in Kansas, there are separate RACES organization, Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Services. RACES is a construct or an organization, if you will, that was created by the federal government shortly after World War II. And has its own kind of set of rules and regulations that the government expects. Primarily, RACES has a mission to support local emergency management organizations at the county level or at the city level. Saturn, which is the Salvation Army Team Emergency Radio Network, another acronym, supports Salvation Army. MARS, the military auxiliary radio system, supports the military, provides backup communications for the military. KC Hart is a unique Kansas City organization that stands for Kansas City Hospital Emergency Amateur Radio Teams. It is an organization that was formed several years ago to support specifically the hospitals. Skywarn supports the National Weather Service. CERT kind of plays in this somewhere. Red Cross has some amateur radio folks in them. The difference, however, in the people that are along that top row is that they all have a specific mission. They all serve a particular organization or a particular function. And so they are emergency communications specific to that particular organization. ARES, by and large, is the foundational element of emergency communications that may or may not also serve some other purpose, but that's where, in the grand scheme of things, that's where everybody is intended to get their amateur radio emergency communications training. So that's how these kind of all fit together in that kind of hierarchy. So the folks below the line there, the basic EmComm training and credentialing and things like that, above the line, those are mission-specific organizations that serve a single entity. So how do you get started? And this is where it gets kind of confusing also. So the first thing is to join your local ARES group. As the diagram indicated, ARES is where all this starts, in my opinion. Now again, there's some regional differences in that, but by and large, ARES is where that starts. Most ARES groups, if they subscribe to the KC Metro credentialing and resource typing process, will ask you to get 4 courses from FEMA, IS 100, 200, 700, and 800. That provides you with some basic, and those are all done online. They don't take very long. My wife did them, so she survived. You get a little certificate, and that's all it is. You do it once and you're done. But they don't take very long, but they provide basic education on the incident command system, which is what FEMA and all the other emergency responders in the world use. And basically, they give you an understanding of how we fit into an emergency response to a disaster. Now, other organizations above ARES, if you will, in that line, may have other mission-specific training requirements. Salvation Army, for instance, asks you to go through 2 classes. One that's called response to, what is it? Emergency disaster services, response to emergency disaster services, or something like that. It's basically education on how the Salvation Army responds to disasters. And the second one is safe from harm, which is basically the equivalent of sexual harassment training, if you've ever done that through your workplace. Because the Salvation Army is serving people that are vulnerable, and that they want to make sure that we're doing that correctly. So they may have, Casey Hart has some training requirements on equipment and protocols and things like that. Our RACES group in Johnson County, Kansas, ask us to go through weather spotting classes every other year, and also do some training and exercising on protocols every other year, and to test that, to make sure we're keeping our skills up. So in addition to those basic requirements, you may also have, depending on what organization you plan to join, you may have other mission-specific training requirements. So let's talk a little bit about some of these. Saturn, again, is a branch of the Salvation Army Emergency Disaster Services. Their headquarters is down on Truman Road at Paseo, roughly. We serve alongside, Saturn members serve alongside other Salvation Army volunteers in a time of disaster. The last large-scale deployment of Saturn was in Joplin. And there were a whole bunch of people from the Kansas City area that went down to Joplin to serve, to serve alongside Salvation Army in Joplin, and I was one of them. That was a life-changing event. I could talk for a long time on that, but not tonight. MARS, Military Auxiliary Radio System. Again, that is an organization that's gone through a little bit of a shift in their mission, but primarily they are a Department of Defense sponsored program that is created to provide a backup source of communications for the military. And they have a very well organized and a very well structured organization to do that. Red Cross has a thing now they call Disaster Services Technology, which gets involved in not only communications, or gets involved in communications with not only amateur radio, but other forms of communications, but also network operations and computer operations and satellites and things like that, all in support of the Red Cross and their response to emergencies. So you can see there's lots of opportunities among these organizations, and I've only highlighted 3 here. There's lots of opportunities to get involved in these organizations and do the things that interest you if you have an interest in emergency communications. So once you figure out, once you join an ARES group and figure out what else you may want to do in addition to that, which I would recommend. Most people that I know that are involved in emergency communications belong to 2 or 3 of these organizations. I belong to ARES, I belong to Saturn, I belong to the RACES organization, which is Johnson County ECS in Johnson County. I also belong to Casey Hart. So, I mean, the question becomes, well, what are you going to do in times of emergency? It's like, well, we'll play that card when we get there. It's just the way it works. But what do you do next? Once you've determined what those are and you've determined how to join and what the training requirements, what do you do next? The key to emergency communications is proficiency. If you aren't any good as a radio operator, you're not going to be any good in an emergency. So the question is, how do you do that, and how do you become prepared for action? That, by the way, is a picture from Joplin. That's Joe, W0PWJ, with his back to you there with that, whatever it is on his side. So he was one of our kind of commanders down there for that operation in Joplin. So let's talk a little bit about proficiency. And I like to use, I haven't done this to you guys, so this will be new to you. I like to use a golf analogy. So you can today go out and spend $200-300 or $400, $500 on a set of clubs. You can go buy some balls, and you can buy some funny clothes and some shoes and things like that. And you can get all this equipment and you can put it in your closet and you go, I'm a golfer. I are a golfer, and never swing a club. But let me ask you a question. Is anybody going to want to play with you? Probably not. Because you're not going to know you're not going to know the rules of the game, you're not going to know how to play the game, you're not going to be any good at it. So the golf analogy is that like a golfer, amateur radio operators can go out and spend thousands of dollars on equipment. We can put up lots of antennas, we can outfit our cars with all kinds of cool stuff. But are we going to be any good in a time of an emergency? Unless we practice. So the key to being a good golfer is getting out and practice. Go to the driving range, play some rounds, get around other people that are good at it and learn from them. And the same holds true for amateur radio. Get out and play some rounds, get out and talk on the radio, get out and get involved with your emergency communications group and participate in their exercises and do public service events and do things like that, because the key to emergency communications is preparedness and proficiency. So there's lots of ways of doing that. There are contesting and special events. The ARRL, I think it's Mike Corey, and I'm trying to remember he's not either one of the ones that are quoted there, but he's a big proponent of contesting as a way to build proficiency in emergency communications, because it requires a fairly rapid pace and it requires you to process information fairly quickly, things like that. There are lots of opportunities to do that through contesting and other special events. WW1 USA, raise your hand, Dave. Yeah, there you go. A lot of you guys have come down. I know the Raytown Club has been a very faithful sponsor of some of the WW1 USA events over the years. That's a great opportunity to come down and practice. Practice your skills. Field day, as always. I mean, the whole point of field day, if you get right down to it, is to demonstrate our emergency communications capabilities. So that is a great opportunity to practice. There are also tons of scheduled ARRL and CQ and other organizations that put on contests practically every weekend, especially during the wintertime when nobody wants to go outside. But that's one way to develop proficiency. Another way is through drills and practices and whatnot, and exercises that your organization may put on. There is in the Kansas City metro area an annual SET, which stands for Simulated Emergency Test, an annual SET exercise, which is always the first Saturday in October. Just like field day is always the fourth weekend in June, the SET drill is always the first Saturday in October. For the last several years, that has been an organized, coordinated event that the MECC, which stands for Metropolitan Emergency Communications Council, Bill, something like that. It's a metro-wide organization made up of emergency communications, amateur radio type folks. Your group may also have smaller scale drills and exercises that they do through the year. So make sure you participate in those things, because those are valuable practice. The Johnson County Aries group every year, and we just had one 3 weeks ago, has a search and rescue drill out at Prairie Center out west of Olathe, where they basically hide something out in the woods and we go find it in the dark. It's a lot of fun, trust me. But anyway, the trouble is, a couple weeks ago it was very cold. But that's an annual drill that Aries does that gives us the opportunity to practice. That is the time that I first learned how to lock my radio. Because that was the first, I got all dressed up with all the garb and things like that and had a, clipboard and everything. And the first thing I did was bump my radio off frequency, and I was screwed. So that was when I learned how to lock my radio. So those are the kind of things you'd much rather learn those in a controlled environment in an exercise than you would out in an emergency in the middle of a tornado in Joplin. The other thing, which is one of the things that's near and dear to my heart, is public service events. I will tell you that public service events and emergency communications go hand in hand, because public service events are no more or no less than an emergency scenario without the emergency. It's set up and it's run just as if we were doing a Joplin or a Greensburg or an Oak Grove or something like that, except that the level of urgency is not there. But the skills and the methods that those events are run and the kind of practice that you'll get in those events is exactly the same. I've told this story a dozen times, and I know a bunch of other people that can tell similar stories. When I got sent to Joplin, I had only been a ham for about a couple years. And I had been through a couple of summers worth of public service events, but I really had not done an emergency of any kind. And so I really had no clue what I was getting into. But I did know what frequency they were using, what repeater they were using in Joplin. So as I'm driving down to Joplin, I tuned in on that frequency at about Fort Scott, which was way farther away than I could get it because the one we were using in Joplin was fairly weak. Because I was worried that I was going to be lost, that this was going to be something way above my head and that I was not going to know what I was going to do. Well, as I finally got into Joplin, I could receive the repeater, I started listening to the traffic. And keep in mind, this is Salvation Army. They are feeding thousands of people that have been affected by this tornado all over a fairly vast area within Joplin there. And I started listening to the traffic on the repeater, and I'm like, this sounds just like a bike ride. It's because it's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's the same kind of information that you're passing back and forth. The protocols are the same. The net, it runs the same. It is a good way. If you do public service events, you're immediately going to be comfortable in a disaster situation. It's just great practice. And the bonus of doing public service events is it also gets you working with other hams that have your same interests. So you get to know a lot of good people and get comfortable with your equipment and get comfortable working with other people, and other people get comfortable working with you. Back to the golf analogy, if you're offered a new golfer in your foursome to tag along who's never played a round of golf before, you're not likely to be very confident in that person's ability to keep up. But if I have worked with Dave, as I have on a number of public service events, and Dave shows up in Joplin, I'm going to go, oh, thank goodness Dave's here, and immediately put him to work in some kind of responsible position. So, those are the kind of things that public service breeds in terms of skills and comfort. And it also helps a good cause. So almost done here. So the key here in emergency communications, this is not a passive activity. If you're going to be an emergency communicator, you need to do something. Check Larry's list for local and regional events. We talked about contests. We talked about special events like WW1 USA. We talked about public service events. Look for things that you can get involved in. The ARRL puts out a very nice contest newsletter, I think once a month or once every 2 weeks. The ARRL also provides a very nice ARES newsletter. These are all email newsletters that if you're an ARRL member, you can subscribe to just by clicking a box. And that tells you a lot about what's going on in other parts of the country with ARES organizations, and also has some good resources, and it gives you a lot of links and things like that, very interesting information. But the key there is do something. From an equipment standpoint, there's not a lot of unique equipment to emergency communications. I would venture to guess that most of you in here already have a 2-meter 440 portable and a 2-meter 440 mobile. That's pretty much the basic requirement. There are then, like any other hobby or any other branch of amateur radio, there's other things you can do to make yourself more useful, like go kits, emergency power, be it generators or solar, things like that, HF capabilities, especially portable HF capabilities. In Joplin, we strung up a dipole between light poles and got on the air one night in support of Salvation Army. But you can always rely on your chosen emergency communications group for guidance. If they've got any special equipment requirements, which is kind of unlikely, but if they do, they'll tell you. But the key there is to be ready. We don't know when disasters are going to occur. We don't know. We got deployed, actually Monday night, there were 3 of us that got deployed with the city of Overland Park to help out with a big fire in Overland Park Monday night. And, nobody knew Monday afternoon that was going to happen. So it was a matter of being ready and being ready to roll. But the key there is be ready, make sure your equipment's there, and you've got what you need and you know how to use it, and be proficient at what you do. And again, these are all pictures from Joplin. I want to point out this one down here on the left. This is a guy that came down to Joplin, I think from Minnesota somewhere. But he was a Saturn member. He's got the Saturn cap on and whatnot. But that was his operating. He was at one of a couple of areas that were set up in Joplin that were stationary locations where people could come for help. And there were all kinds of various, you could get your chainsaw sharpened there, you could get flat tires fixed, you could get food, you could get supplies, you could get first aid. and he was at one of those, and that was his operating position. So he's basically got his clipboard on top of a cardboard box, sitting on a folding chair with a Go kit in a toolbox. That was it. But he was wonderfully, I mean, he came ready. We knew we could set him out there, and he sat out there all day and did a great job. But that's typical of what you'd be dealing with. So the other thing, let me back up one thing on that in terms of the be ready. A couple points to be made about readiness. One is that more than likely that if you're deployed for an emergency communications, if you're deployed for disaster, it's probably not going to be here. It's going to be somewhere else. Because if it's here, you have other priorities. If we get hit by a tornado the size of Joplin, you got other things to worry about, like in Oak Grove. You got other things to worry about than helping other people in emergency communications. There will be other amateur radio operators come from outside the area to help in that situation, just like we would go to Joplin, or we would go to Greensburg, or we would go somewhere else to help them. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that it's not the emergency or the disaster that happens here that probably gets you activated as an emergency communications person. It's the disaster that happens in the middle of Kansas or in southern Missouri, or the earthquake that happens in the New Madrid zone. The other thing to think about is that, and this history has shown this to be true, is that it's not always a natural disaster that causes emergency communications to come into play. Not too many, I think it was a couple of years ago in Lincoln, Nebraska, something happened to their 911 system, and they couldn't receive 911 calls, and they couldn't dispatch ambulances or fire trucks. And so they deployed amateur radio resources into fire stations and ambulance houses and places like that, and we became their communication. So keep in mind that it's not always the tornado or the earthquake or the flood or something like that. It could be that, or it could be some kind of cyber activity, that sort of this stuff. So. Okay, I think that's it, guys. I think the key there is find a way to get involved, and once you decide you're going to get involved in emergency communications, work at it. Don't just sit around and wait for something to happen. Work at it. Do something to keep yourself active and keep yourself proficient, and make sure that you're comfortable with what you're doing.